Well, sure. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to NYPAY for having me here this evening. My name is Neil Kaufman. As Michael said earlier, I'm the managing member of Kaufman McGowan PLLC. We're one of the leading corporate cannabis law firms in the country. We've participated in over $2 billion of cannabis industry transactions over the last 8 or 9 years. And if I may, I'd like to sort of weave together some of the threads that we've started discussing tonight and clarify a couple of things. So first of all, let's be clear. Banking services are critical to all levels of the cannabis industry. We tend to focus on the retailers because there are so many of them, but many of our cultivation and processing clients are also badly need banking services. You know, Dean is absolutely right that the FinCEN guidance has been the foundation of the ability for banks to provide banking services to the cannabis industry for a long time. The FinCEN guidance itself was built on the Cole memo. Some of you that are familiar with the industry may know the Cole memo has since been rescinded during the Trump administration. Nevertheless, the FinCEN guidance has been confirmed. Actually, the Cole memo priorities are very similar to the general priorities that U.S. attorneys operate under. And so that FinCEN guidance remains in effect. Now, Dina was also right that that guidance is very general. And many people were concerned, well, if I have to file SARs, do I have to file SARs every day because there are transactions every day? And as the years have gone by, I think folks have become comfortable with the way this process has developed. There has been no rush by regulators to crack down on banks providing services to cannabis companies at all. There are very few reported regulatory actions taken. And in fact, for the most part, a bank that takes on a cannabis-related customer needs to file a SAR at the beginning and then monitor that company. And so long as there are no indications of running afoul of the Cole memo priorities, there's an update after 90 days. And after that, there's really not an issue. It's only when, as a result of the bank's ongoing due diligence process, they notice an issue that may be arising, that's when additional actions need to be taken. With respect to New York, Michael, as you alluded to, we're fortunate in New York, we've got at least 10 or so banks and other financial institutions that are providing bank account services to cannabis-related businesses, which is a critical first step. The next step in banking services is lending, and we're starting to see a little bit of activity of banking institutions providing some type of loans to cannabis companies, initially usually collateralized by their real estate. There's been some talk in New York about a government-supported effort to facilitate lending to cannabis businesses, and that would be a major step forward. You know, back in the old days, in 2015, 16, when a lot of us first got involved, especially out west, where we did a lot of work. At one point, we represented 4 of the 5 largest cannabis cultivators in California. You know, they were dying for bank accounts, and they couldn't find literally any banks to provide them any level of services. That pressure has decreased quite a bit. There are now banks like Dart Bank and some others that do provide services in multiple states. So that sort of crisis mentality that we had a number of years ago has eased. But expanding into lending is a whole different ballgame. I think banks will find it attractive to go into that more and more as they realize that they can generate a higher return on their capital, because cannabis and lending generally throws off a higher interest rate that your borrowers will pay than non-cannabis. And then, you know, as Carol indicated, payment processing is really the backbreaker right now in the cannabis industry because it's controlled by MasterCard and Visa, and they just won't do it. Now, we're all going to be interested to see what happens if the Safe Banking Act passes Congress, whether that will make the payment processors more comfortable whether that might be extended to the capital markets on some level. And if either or both of those things happen, I think we're going to see an explosion of financial services being provided to the cannabis industry.
That's great, Neil. And I think that's an excellent point to make, is because everybody's going to have fear of missing out. If you get on board early, you learn about the business early, you know what skill sets you need, you know what technologies you need, you'll be way ahead of the game before the gold rush starts, if you will. Let me ask this, start with, and Kirill, let me ask you, you touched upon them a bit, but talk about the issues facing a cannabis-related business in terms of being cash intensive. Obviously, you've got safety and security issues, cost issues, and talk about your journey in terms of finding banks. I mean, we've all heard the horror stories early on. If you did get a bank account, you were paying atrocious monthly fees for that service. Now, they've all come down in the past couple of years, but what are your thoughts on that in terms of that journey, finding a banking relationship?
Well, we've gone through, that's a very valid question. I'm sure everybody has been in the industry since about 2014 or 15 or earlier, have experienced pretty much very similar takes on it. So you're right. It was virtually impossible, as Neil just mentioned, it was virtually impossible to find an institution that will bank you. And then you would, if you were able to obtain an account, it would be limited to just that, just an account, no other services. The fees were outrageous, and especially if you have multiple locations that, God forbid, happen to have multiple EINs, then forget it. Then your fees, your just cost of carrying your bank accounts can run into thousands upon thousands. And so if you don't do that, then you have accountability complexity. So it's something that you have to find an equivalent at some point. Now with our current solution, again, Danielle, thank you very much. We are able to bank reasonably at one institution. I'm able to move the funds and pay the vendors, as many vendors now require ACHs, and it was very, very convenient now.
But you're still dealing with the cost of transporting that cash that you receive for payments for your services to the bank ultimately. Yeah.
Correct. So we do utilize third-party carrier that transports cash to the Fed to be deposited electronically into the bank accounts.
Just a quick question. Have you ever worked with any of the virtual vaults where you would take cash in at your dispensary and it would be accounted for and be considered deposited, even though the physical cash was still on site?
We have not. I can't say that we have. We have looked into that, but every option that was presented was cost prohibitive. Mm-hmm. If you figure the upfront cost, maintenance cost, the learning curve, and the basically reliability upon our employees, you have to have one very high volume location to make it worthwhile, I think. Understood.
Danielle, speaking to some of Kirill's concerns early on, how did you all deal with that and determining how you're going to bank these folks?
Obviously they saw the need out there. I mean, there's cash and cash, a lot of cash that was just floating around. It wasn't safe, for Kirill's business, for his, pardon me, his employees, not to mention some of the communities. So being able to, take that into consideration and really look at, okay, what do we need to do to be able to provide alternative solutions and do it in a compliant manner. We partnered, or I wouldn't say partner, but we work with a host of transport companies in order to kind of help service all of our customers, provide them with options if they need recommendations. But then also we spent time developing the whole cash management suite. So then we were able to help our customers transition away from cash. And in the beginning, it obviously wasn't right away, because it's great if Kirill has all these services and he's able to pay all of his vendors in a certain way, but his vendors don't yet have a bank account or haven't quite transitioned to using these other forms of payments. So, where he's using wires, where he's able to use bill pay, remote deposit, mobile deposit, smart safes is I think you were speaking to.
Right.
I mean, that's another big kind of up and coming thing that we're starting to see a lot more businesses utilize, to kind of eliminate the time between them taking in the cash and the time that their armored car service comes, gets it, and actually takes it so it can be deposited either at the Federal Reserve or at the bank.
That's great. Neil, any of your clients have any particular story, or when can we talk about the famous unintended consequences of regulation? You have any stories you can share with us of well-intentioned legislation, regulation that ended up being onerous to the CRBs?
Oh, well, New York is the poster child for that, but I think that's happened in almost every state. From a big picture standpoint, Michael, the challenge that we face in the cannabis industry is that the cannabis industry has been around for 10,000 years. It's a $300 billion worldwide industry. Only in the last 120 years or so has it been illegal. So all these various state regulators think that they can structure their laws and their regulations in a way that will shape the market in their state without fully realizing, over and over again, without fully realizing that whatever they do to distort their marketplace to meet their own political needs or preferences, all that happens is the market backfills. So all these states that have raging black markets, it's not only because, but it's partly because their regulatory structure doesn't allow the industry to function fully. And so almost every state has made that mistake. And New York has as well. New York and Washington are the only states that have the alcohol-driven two-tier market requirements. It's kind of insane. There's no reason for it. And so, you could go state by state and check every box for how the best of intentions to try to protect their state and make their state homegrown, like in Colorado and Washington, where they had residency requirements, severely crippled the ability of cannabis companies to raise the capital necessary, because cannabis is a very capital-intensive business. And when you cut off the rest of the marketplace from those local cannabis companies, you choke your local industry. That's why we haven't seen nearly as many, I think, Colorado-based companies become national leaders as you would have thought, given Colorado's first mover advantage in the recreational marketplace. Well, they strangled their industry for a few years, as Washington did. New York's taken a different approach. While they haven't imposed residency requirements, they've imposed severely draconian limitations, resulting in almost any experienced cannabis investor not being allowed to invest in New York. Again, way to go if you want to choke off your industry and all the social inequity applicants that you want to help grow. Unbelievable examples of the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, I spoke with the treasurer of the state of California late last year, and she had mentioned that the state income tax level was great. It was a boon for the state, but nothing was there that limited or restricted counties and municipalities for layering on additional taxes. So some of these CRBs, including the cost of licensing, were paying well over 50% effective tax rates in moves.
Right.
So
And as a result, those businesses struggled and couldn't compete effectively with the black market. As a result, the black market just boomed. And now, a few years later, California has realized the error of those particular ways and scaled back their tax burden considerably.
Real, you mentioned early on the search for banks, and talk about, and we was mentioned a little bit earlier about lending. I think there's a question about that in the chat. What are you all doing in terms of your borrowing needs?
Well, we've been lucky enough to be self-funded to this day. So anything is either self-funded or organically grown. So we'll either open a new location based on the competitive application process, or if we needed to purchase equipment or expand into one industry or another, we do it our own proceeds.
Do you see a lot of your competitors out there self-funding as well at this point in time?
We're also seeing many competitors that went public, and unfortunately was not the best step to take. We see a lot of stock dropping, and I understand the cautiousness of the banking institutions in terms of lending to the actual cannabis businesses. Right now, unfortunately, the industry is very volatile, and it is no longer a novelty. There's no longer crazy profits for the bulk of the industry across the board. Although there are some spots where you can still make initial 10-year-old, whatever we were the margins that were present 10 years ago. But overall, what we've experienced in going from one state and expanding to others is that as the industry matures, so do the profit margins. So it becomes a regular, really no different than liquor business inventory, I think.
Yeah.
Except for the higher tax rate. Because of 288.
Tax rate, and then I think I wanted to actually go back to Michael's question to Neil. I think, Michael, you wanted Neil to touch base on some of the, unintended consequences?
Right.
I think a better question would be, show me examples where there are none. And it's much easier to name those.
I don't think there are any of those. Are you aware of any?
That would be a utopian world, especially in marijuana. But I am glad actually to touch base, to touch on that point. Just the other day, I was present at a meeting where Attorney General of California is actually taking steps into minimizing, or at least taking some action on land use law in curbing the illegal California businesses. Because I think in California, that is the biggest challenge that's battling legal businesses.
Now, that's a problem everywhere, really.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge because the tax rates are so high. The black market doesn't have to pay those taxes. The regulatory burdens and cost of compliance are so high, and the black market doesn't have to pay those costs. So when you add that up, it's just very difficult to compete qualitatively if you're in the legal market.
Yeah.
And make
one thing I want to touch on over your left-hand shoulder, you talk about mergers, acquisitions on your backdrop. Krill, what do you, from a strategic standpoint? I mean, I've seen in multiple industries where you have a lot of new entrants, a lot of mom and pop players. The field gets flooded, and ultimately there's a consolidation that occurs. And so, from your perspective, you're probably one of the bigger players. And Danielle, from your perspective, if you're banking a bunch of these players and they get merged out, what risks does that pose to the bank? And Krill, what opportunities do you guys see out there in terms of an overall strategic perspective?
Danielle?
We've seen a huge increase in mergers and acquisitions, obviously within the last year, especially. Thankfully, we've been able to retain a lot of relationships, and I think that's really what it is. It's differentiating yourself as a bank and really just, doing everything you can to provide the services that your customers need so that they continue to keep the deposits with you, no matter, which way the merger and the acquisition goes.
And I think, for the bankers out there, that's something you really need to consider. If you're going to make the investment and the time and the capital and the personnel to effectively get into this business, then you've got to look longer term, is that ultimately you will have people that get bought out and merged. Are you going to be able to keep that business? Because if not, you made a huge investment and all of a sudden you lose all these deposits. Mm-hmm. One other last point on the banking side, Danielle, is lending. We've got a couple of questions on lending. Where do you all stand on that?
We do lend, but being the size of the bank that we are, we do have a small bucket. Mm-hmm. And as you can imagine, that bucket filled up very quickly. Because again, the lending side of things, the cost of funds is way lower if you're going to go through a bank than some of the other alternatives that are out there.
And I think to Neil's point, most of these loans are probably classified as commercial real estate because they're being secured by land or buildings or whatever.
Correct.
And keep in mind, Michael, in many, many states, all but a few really, you really can't perfect your lien on a lot of your collateral. Your inventory, in order to take possession of the inventory and resell it, you need a license, right? Which a bank's not going to have. And there are very few accounts receivable because many states require very quick turns of payables. So there's a real lack of collateral on which banks can rely upon to lend, which is part of the reason why we've seen, we saw over the last few years, a huge amount of lending coming into the cannabis industry from non-bank hedge funds. Like a lot of the distressed hedge funds that were seeking higher yield found it in cannabis because cannabis borrowers couldn't borrow sufficiently from their banks. So they borrowed from the hedge funds. And then we find the banks and the hedge funds need to play nice over control agreements and things like that in order for the hedge funds to have any comfort in their collateral to the extent it finds its way into bank accounts. So it's been a complex journey. On the mergers and acquisitions front, that activity has slowed down considerably over the last 6 to 12 months because primarily of the lack of capital in the cannabis industry and the collapse of cannabis public stocks. So many of the acquirers who were going out and buying up, on the consolidation plays, they no longer have the cash to pay, and their stocks are in the dump. So they don't really want to issue stock as payment for their acquisitions. So we've seen really a severe pullback in the cannabis M&A market, rolling into more of a transition towards a distressed M&A market where some of the industry players that are really struggling in the current environments with high tax rates, compressed margins, collapse in crop prices, et cetera, are just running out of money and running out of runway without capital available to them and are ending up having to get sold at distressed prices, or in some cases, like we saw in California with herbal, just collapsing.
Yeah. Interesting question just came up. We touched around what payments you can't take. And, Creel's company's all cash-based right now. And the only other legal source that I found are closed loop ACH systems to be able to do something that's non-cash. But obviously, Visa and MasterCard have clamped down on this thing. And I'll just open this up to the group, is to what do you think of the closed loop ACH as an alternative until you're able to get branded cards into the loop.
That's all there is, besides cash, right?
Yeah,
What do you
I
think,
mean,
Danielle, Carol?
I mean, really, that's the biggest struggle right now, the limited access to non-cash payment solutions. You know, look at all the things that have happened with cashless ATMs and then with MasterCard and Visa. I mean, things are they're changing. So whatever it is you decide to do, I would just always make sure you have a plan B.
I think Neil nailed it. That's all there is. But that does not answer the question of consumer demands. So consumer is willing to pay more, but only if allowed to pay with a credit card. Consumers are not walking around or into your store with little bank app willing to ACH you the money.
Mm-hmm.
So that solves your supply and vendor solution, right, problem, but doesn't do anything on the front end.
And let me just leave with this, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A and then the breakout session. Is ultimately, where do you say we've really focused, and we touched on earlier, we focused on dispensaries, but in the entire supply chain, from the grower, the cultivator, the processor, so on and so forth, I think banks need to realize, if there's an opportunity, look in your primary service area, where is that opportunity? Is it the dispensary, as we all been talking about, or is it further up that supply chain, ultimately to the grower? You're somewhat vertically integrated, aren't you, Kirill?
In some states.
Yeah, and Danielle, do your clients go across that spectrum of the supply chain, or are you more focused on the dispensary side?
No, we have the whole spectrum.
And on the grower side, do you take some extra? Have you done ag lending in the past?
I know Dart Bank, in its history, has done a lot of ag lending, but not in this space that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ron or Dave, do you want to present us with some questions that are out there?
I think, David, you're going to pick up the questions.
Well, sure. We already talked a little bit about alternatives to using cash. What else have we got in here? We had a question about banks that service cannabis-related businesses. I think there's some in the chat. Y'all should recognize that you can save the chat at the end of this conversation by going to the little arrow down at the bottom of the chat to save the list. What else do we have here? There was a comment that Deidre posted about New York and but that was really a question. That was a comment about the fine to building owners that knowingly rent to commercial space for legal cannabis businesses.
Yeah, so that was authorized by the state legislature a month or two ago in an effort to try to combat the black market activity in New York City, especially. I mean, there's something like 1,500 illegal retail cannabis stores.
They're all around me. They're all around my apartment, right? Everywhere I go.
Yeah, and not to mention every smoke shop, half the bodegas, and they just can't really shut them down fast enough. There's just no capacity on the part of law enforcement to be able to adequately address that. So they're threatening the landlords, fine. Shutting down the stores is no threat because they're just open again the next day. Even if the sheriff comes in and seizes the inventory, they acquire other inventory. Even like Empire Cannabis was shut down. They had showdowns with the police and the owners, and they were open the next day. And so it would take like probably well more than a year at the pace that law enforcement could possibly go to shut down every single black market retail cannabis store in New York City. So you get shut down today, you open tomorrow, you operate for another year. Oh, okay, you get another $10,000 fine, or you get a $50,000 fine. Okay, well, that's the cost of doing business.
There was one other. Go ahead, Michael.
I was just gonna say, I noticed one comment about FinCan being able to offer compliant MasterCard, Visa, PIN debit merchant processing. Who on the panel's familiar with that?
Well, I am, because I know Nathaniel Gurian and I have represented FinCan over the years. And so, look, other ways people have sort of gotten around the MasterCard Visa problem is by using foreign processing, where it's significantly higher cost, but you can route the processing outside the US. Sometimes people just lie about it and use straw entities until they get caught, and try to daisy chain that along with repeated straw entities. Maybe Nathaniel's got some other brilliant solution. He might. I don't know.